Anyway, the church and state continued conflict. I've already mentioned how that Henry IV had to bow to the church for a time. Well, what wound up initially was the church became supreme, particularly under the leadership of Pope Innocent. Innocent III was the most powerful pope who ever lived. He told King Philip Augustus, when Philip wanted to divorce his wife, he said, "You take back the wife that you married when you were young. You may not divorce your wife and marry another woman." And even Philip had to comply. He told King John of England, "I'm going to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury and you won't," and forced John to recant. He took on the Holy Roman Emperor and won that one also. The Holy Roman Emperor was, I believe, Henry IV. I might be a little bit mixed up there, but anyway, he took on and won. He ordered 2 crusades. Now, unfortunately, his crusades did not amount to much, but everything else he did. Now, it has been said that Pope Innocent III was actually a little bitty man, and there around, in and around Rome, he got no respect whatever. But for people who didn't know him, he appeared to be very big and powerful and monstrous. But inside his own habitat, he was henpecked. Well, maybe henpecked's not the right word to use, but he was not even in control of his own palace. But he was in control of the more powerful kings of Europe. Now, here's the bad part of this. Under him, the church began persecuting people who disagreed with it. He led a crusade not against the Muslims, but crusades against dissenters here in southern France. And he led a crusade against, what was happening, folks, was the rumblings that would eventually lead to the Protestant Reformation were getting started as more and more people began to question the practice of the church. And Innocent instituted what we call holy orders, or the Inquisition. Holy orders is another name for Inquisition. Now, today, folk, the church is very embarrassed by the Inquisition, and after many, many years, we finally had a Pope Paul II apologized for the Inquisition. In one of the books I have at the house said that no pope, none of those popes have ever apologized. Well, that book is out of date. One finally did. The Inquisition was where that they would question a person under torture and put a person on a rack and pull his joints apart one at a time in a very, very painful form, just to try to wiggle a confession out of a person. It was very gruesome. More than 1 million people are believed to have died at the hands of the Inquisition. They would burn people at the stake whom they suspected of heresy. Heresy. Now, what is it? Heresy is where you disagree with the church. If you hold a doctrine that's in disagreement with the church, you're considered a heretic. Well, heresy was outlawed, and heretics were killed under Innocent and the popes who came after him. Innocent used the interdict, which I've talked about, to get his way, telling persons that, hey, if your king has been put under interdict, you're going straight to hell when you die, and all the marriages that are performed are not valid, and no extreme unctions. The sacraments, again, he established Innocent that there were 7 sacraments. One of them the sacrament of marriage, another one the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, and 5 others. Extreme unction was one of them, where when a person was either just had died or about to die, or they're certain is going to die, they perform the last, what they call last rites. Now, in addition, he began the practice, and folk, I want to tell you before I start, I can never talk about this subject without blushing, and in a minute you'll know why. But he began the practice of the sale of indulgencies. All right. Now, an indulgency was where it started out with the belief that you could free your loved ones from purgatory by giving a certain amount of money. Well, much too often, a priest would fleece a poor widow whose husband had died. She wanted to make sure he went to heaven, so she would give everything she had to the church and wind up impoverished. this happened more than once. Now again, this practice has been curtailed, or if not outlawed by the church. But eventually indulgences came to mean that you could purchase for yourself forgiveness for sins. Now, all right, now if you wanted to commit a certain sin, you would go to a priest and you'd tell the priest in confidence what sin you wanted to commit. The priest then would work out an agreement with you how much you were to pay. In other words, how much you paid depended on how big a sin you wanted to commit and how much sinning you wanted to do. Then the priest would write you out a bill of forgiveness called an indulgency. You'd pay the priest and you'd take home the indulgency. And it was understood that after you'd done that, you were going to go out and at least attempt to commit the sin you had just purchased forgiveness for.
That is by Innocent the Third.
Innocent the Third got the practice started, yes.
Oh my God.
Now, if you're thinking there's something wrong with the theology, everybody today does, and I've even had Catholics in my class who they're against it. Even the Catholic Church today is against the sale of indulgences. Now, if you read on, the sale of indulgences bumped head on into a man one day. Anybody know which man I'm talking about? And they bumped head on into a man named Martin Luther. Again, some of you might have heard about it. Martin Luther hit him hard. And eventually, the Catholic Church stopped the hawking of indulgences. But that was many years later. Innocent III lived in the 1200s. Martin Luther lived in the early 1500s. But this one, now the sale of indulgences you might consider important because the money from the sale of indulgences was used to build St. Peter's, a magnificent palace for the popes, which still exists, still stands. And when every time a pope is appointed, and one was last year,
Would you
they go to St. Peter's, yes.
Wouldn't you consider that building slightly sacrilegious?
That's more theology.
It built on the benefits.
Here's the thing now about it. Anything that's touched by human hands is going to be flawed.
Sure, but then you're fleecing people for money for
Well,
doing things that are otherwise.
Okay, you can if you want to. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to go there. I mean, it's hard enough to have gone as far as I have.
No, I'm just
I mean,
saying.
some of you might be Roman, and again, for you Roman Catholics, they might be in here. Even the Catholic Church is against the sale of indulgences. And some student loaned me a DVD about Martin Luther that was written by, the DVD was made by two Catholic priests, and they said in effect, yeah, Martin Luther was right. I mean, I've seen it in Catholic literature. Even they will tell you, the Catholic priest, if you go, that Martin Luther was right. And that they were wrong, and it's one of the things that they did that, along with it, that they regret. But again, they did a few things right, and one of them was they wound up, they separated church from state, which a lot of the rest of the world was not able to do. It was not always a nice straight path, but nevertheless, when it was over with, they'd separated church from state. All right. Women got involved in the church also as nuns. And at first they isolated themselves, but then they went out and became like the nurses of the community, and they restored a lot of sick people to health who might otherwise have died. They raised gardens. They assisted the poor, the feeble, and did a lot of the work that was needed in Europe. Actually, your book calls it Holy Office here. I thought it was Holy Orders, but I'll change it. Holy Office. Holy Office. Again, I'm looking at the bottom of page 349. There was a big separation between the clergy on the one hand and the laity on the other. The word lay means persons who are not clergy, as opposed to clergy. Anyway, the Virgin Mary became very, very high revered during this time, during the High Middle Ages. And a lot of people would pray to the Virgin Mary believing that, well, I'm just not good enough or worthy to pray to Jesus, so they prayed to Mary. And eventually started worshiping Mary's mother, Anna. And in the case of Martin Luther, and I mean, that's more for Second Smith, Martin Luther was walking along one day, and all of a sudden a thunderstorm came up. And he sought shelter under a tree, and folk don't ever do this. Go into a ditch or something. But luckily he was not lightning struck, but he sought shelter under a tree, and he didn't feel like he was worthy to pray to Jesus. he didn't feel like he's even worthy enough to pray to Mary, so he prayed to Anna, Mary's mother, and said, Anna, Saint Anna, please help me. If you let me survive this, I'll become a monk. He survived it and then went into the monastery and became a monk, and went on to change the whole course of Western civilization. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit, but Mary became extremely important in the worship at that time. All right, which takes us up to leaving secularism to universities. A lot of persons say that one of the reasons that Europe expanded in its knowledge and became inventive and eventually became the highest level, achieved the highest level of learning was they set up universities. The very first university was set up at Bologna, Italy. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, spelling that right. Bologna, and essentially it was just a learned older man would collect some younger men around him, and he would teach these younger men what he knew. The main form of study at first was liberal arts, just get a broad education in liberal arts, which they consider important. And even today, a lot of persons will say if you have liberal arts, you can be prepared to step into just about any field you want to. Others will say liberal arts is a worthless field. You need to take something practical like engineering. But be that as it may, yes, history is considered liberal arts, and I got my degree in liberal arts, you might say. But grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, these were the subjects they learned. And teaching was all by the lecture method. The word lecture comes from the word lectern, where a teacher stands in front of a lectern and lectures his students. Eventually it became degree-granting institutions. After you completed a certain amount of study, you'd be given a degree. The degrees were, of course, eventually they became bachelor's degree, the first degree, then master's degree, and then doctor's degree, the doctor's being the highest. To get a doctor's degree, you had to pass the final examination. And the doctor's degree qualified you to teach on the subject. Today, it was fast changing, but you can teach with a master's degree also. But students who received degrees, it was known a degree would enable you to go on and pursue a lucrative career that otherwise you would not be able to. Now, scholasticism, and I'm going to have to close. Scholasticism came about as a result of the conflict between science and theology. Now, folk, I mentioned, like in connection with chapter 1, polytheistic religions have no problem with science and theology because science is theology, theology is science, they're one and the same. But you get into monotheistic religions, the monotheistic God will claim that he created the world, and then the science will come in and say, no, the world put itself together. And this has led to a conflict that has lasted to this day. In fact, this very year there was a debate between a famous creationist and a famous scientist who really, some people say, is not really a science, but he's called the science guy. The conflict is still going on. But scholasticism was set up to try to reconcile the two. They really had an affinity for, oh, by the way, the university spread from Bologna to Paris, and from Paris to Oxford in England, and the Oxford University is still there. Anyway, scholasticism, they've had a real love for Aristotle. Actually, it went to the point of ridiculousness, but nevertheless, they would, if they wanted an answer to a scientific question, they'd page Aristotle, and they believed that he was absolutely right. And Aristotle, with all due respect, he said that he told his followers, examine what I say and see if I'm right or see if I'm wrong. But they would accept Aristotle without question. And this had to be wrong. It wasn't until the time of Galileo, who came in the 1600s, that he said, hey, Aristotle was wrong. Who are you to say Aristotle was wrong? Well, I can prove it. But they had a, you might say, one person put it this way, they baptized Aristotle. They made Aristotle into a Christian, even though Aristotle actually lived 300 years before Jesus Christ. But nevertheless, they tried to make like he was one of the best Christian men who ever lived, even though he hardly could have been. And Aristotle also made some really serious blunders. Anyway, Thomas Aquinas now, there have been men who have tried to explain the universe. Plato did, Aristotle did, then later you have Sir Isaac Newton, he tried to explain the universe, and more recently Albert Einstein. But in between those, in between Aristotle and Einstein, is a man you probably never have heard of, but he was the one who was accepted the most by the people for hundreds of years before Newton. He said that he believed he could answer every question that had ever been asked. He knew the answer. He could tell you how many angels could stand on the head of a pin.
He's a saint, right?
What's that?
Is he a saint?
Saint, yeah, saint. Yeah, right. He's a saint. Yeah, Saint Thomas Aquinas. Today, he's very little regarded. And so if you don't hear as much about him, but he explained the universe. And I want to say this about explaining the universe. Einstein got together what he was going to call the theory of everything, or the TOE, theory of everything, that we someday, and in 1950, folk, after we split town, we believed we almost had a theory that could explain everything. Fast forward to 2014, and some scientists are ready to admit that there's some things about this universe that we simply are not going to explain, that simply have no explanation. Like why do the distant galaxies seem to be moving away from us at 25,000 miles a second? What kind of energy could make whole clusters of galaxies move at that kind of speed? And we can't see the energy either, can't feel it. So what makes them, again, folk, and I have also heard it's one of the basic questions about electricity. Which direction does the electricity flow? Is it from positive, negative, negative, positive? We thought we had it figured out. The electricity flows from negative, positive, until the invention of the transistor. Today, you don't even ask the question. Only the beginners ask that. Anyone who knows anything about electricity knows we don't know. And don't even ask. I mean, just basic stuff. I mean, my nephew once asked my brother, his dad, what makes a magnet work? And my brother answered, nobody knows. Some people think they know, but we don't know. How does gravity work? Theories abound. Can't be explained. How's that?
It just does.
It's there. The gravity is there. You can't explain it. All right, but anyway, they believed they could explain the universe. Aquinas tried to explain the universe as best he could. All right, I'm going to have to stop.